how we perceive them. But it turns out that social cognition and non-social cognition don't overlap completely. There are major differences between cognition, when you think about cognition of inanimate objects like mugs or Necker cubes or visual illusions or whatever, and cognition about people. We're going to start in this class from the assumption that the same principles that we understand apply to cognition in the non-social domain also apply in the social domain. But it's going to become very apparent very quickly that that's not true. That's just a starting assumption that provides a framework for the course, because it turns out that social cognition and non-social cognition differ in very important ways. Some of these ways are what I characterize as quantitative differences. There are differences in degree between the social case and the non-social case. It is fundamental doctrine in cognitive psychology that the stimulus for cognition is impoverished, vague, fragmentary. What the perceiver has to do is to add something to the stimulus, to extract information from the stimulus, but also bring knowledge from memory and past experience to bear on the act of perceiving. That's true whether you're looking at a Necker cube or a standard figure ground, or you're memorizing a list of words or whatever. The stimulus needs to be supplemented by knowledge drawn from memory. But it turns out to be especially true in the social case. In the social case, when we look at some people, what's the stimulus for social cognition? It's other people and their behavior. And other people and their behavior that's very ambiguous stuff. You walk up to somebody and you go, gee, I wonder if she likes me or not. You don't know. You don't wear a sign that says, I like you very much, right on the forehead. You gotta figure this out. And the way you figure this out is by picking up on cues. And sometimes you make too much of those cues. Sometimes you make too little of those cues. But you're still trying to pick up on these very ambiguous cues. Behavior is very ambiguous. You walk across campus and you see two kids fighting. You might think, geez, that's something that I ought to break up. You go over and you break it up. And the next thing you know, you've interrupted somebody from the film department who's making a movie for his senior thesis, right? The behavior is ambiguous. Social behavior is inherently ambiguous. We have to figure it out, okay? All stimulation is ambiguous in that sense, but social stimuli are even more so. The ambiguity of the social situation comes in part from the fact that there are so many different kinds of clues that may be in conflict. You're talking to somebody and she's smiling at you, but there's something in the tone of voice that makes you think that maybe that smile isn't quite right. Well, what you going to go with? You got to resolve that conflict. There are also lots of context effects that you have to deal with. The meaning of social behavior changes a lot depending on the context in which that social behavior occurs. Here's a very good example of this from the terror attacks on the World Trade Center in September 11th, 2001. Famous picture taken from the Brooklyn Esplanade across the river looking towards Manhattan. And a number, look at this. I mean, there's the World Trade Center going up in smoke, and there are these people here. What are they doing? You don't really know what they're doing. Frank Rich, writing in the New York Times, was outraged by this picture. He said, I can only, this is a country that likes to move on and fast. These young people aren't necessarily callous, so writes Frank Rich, meaning, of course, they are necessarily callous, and they look like they're ignoring this whole thing. Thomas Hepker says, they just seem totally relaxed, like it was any normal afternoon. They were just chatting away. It's possible they lost people and cared, but they certainly didn't look at it. Whereas David Plotz, looking at exactly the same picture, says, these individuals have turned toward each other for solace and for debate. Same stimulus, three quite different representations of this event. You get three quite different representations of the event because all the information you need to perceive the stimulus isn't provided by the stimulus itself. You've got to know more about the context. If I just shown you a picture of these people without this part, you'd say, they're chatting away on a nice afternoon on the Brooklyn Esplanade. You put this into context, the meaning begins to change quite a bit. These individuals actually reacted to these newspaper calls. What are you talking about? Of course we were concerned. We were a bunch of New Yorkers in the middle of an animated discussion about what had just happened. Another participant says, it was genetically impossible for me to be unaffected by this event. So what this event looked like from the point of view of the participants was very different from that same event in terms of what it looked like from the point of view of an external observer. The social situation is inherently vague and ambiguous. The information supplied by the social stimulus is very fragmentary and impoverished. We have to think about what we're looking at in order to make sense of it. And of course, when we construct our perceptions of the social world in this way, we bring our own prejudices and assumptions to bear on the task as well. Here is a very historically very important example from the New Hampshire primaries in 1972. This is Edwin Muskie, then the senator from Maine who was campaigning in the New Hampshire primary. You can't see it from here, but he's coming out of the doorway of the offices of the Manchester Union Leader, the leading newspaper in New Hampshire. A newspaper so conservative, Attila the Hun looks like a leftist. And they had just criticized Muskie and especially criticized Muskie's wife on some matter, whatever it was, it doesn't matter. And Muskie comes out and holds an impromptu press conference on the steps of the office, and it looks like he's crying. Of course, he's also giving this impromptu press conference in the middle of a famous New Hampshire snowstorm. It's February in New Hampshire. Snow's coming down. Are those tears or are those snowflakes melting on his face? It makes a big difference how you're going to perceive this guy as a political candidate, because especially in 1972, male presidential candidates weren't supposed to cry. Female presidential candidates weren't supposed to cry either. So in the last presidential election, you'll remember Hillary Rodham Clinton, the senator from New York, had her own Muskie moment also in the New Hampshire primary when she was asked about how she was bearing up under the criticism that was being sent her way in the press. And she looks like she's kind of welling up there. You can't actually see it here, but her eyes are glistening up. William Crystal, commentator on Fox News, says she pretended to cry, kind of a ploy for sympathy. Britt Hume says, I don't think so. Same stimulus. William Crystal bringing one set of feelings and attitudes and beliefs to this stimulus. Britt Hume bringing another set of feelings and attitudes and beliefs. The stimulus is vague and fragmentary and impoverished. All stimuli are vague and fragmentary and impoverished. Social stimuli, just the more so. Okay, so in these examples, we can see another way in which social cognition and non-social cognition are quantitatively different. That is, they differ from each other in degree, because it turns out that emotional and motivational processes have more to work with in social cognition than they do in non-social cognition. Yes, there's a famous experiment that shows that poor children in the Depression thought that a quarter was bigger than it was, right? As opposed to rich kids in the Depression who thought that a quarter was smaller than it was. That's an example of emotional and motivational influences on non-social cognition. But if you think about it for just half a nanosecond, you'll see that when we're trying to make sense of the social world, the mood we're in, what we want, what our goals are, is going to have a tremendous impact on how we think about the social world. Again, that's true in non-social cognition. It's just more true in social cognition. Okay, but there are also what I think of as some qualitative differences. Differences not just in degree, but differences in kind. Certain aspects of social cognition that don't have their counterpart to any degree in the non-social case. One possibility is that there are different brain structures dedicated to social cognition compared to non-social cognition. This is a question that we'll talk about towards the end of the semester when we look at social neuropsychology and social neuroscience. But it's entirely possible that, given the modular structure of the brain, that social perception is performed by a different set of brain structures than non-social perception is. To the extent that that's true, that would be a qualitative difference between social and non-social cognition. Another qualitative difference between social and non-social cognition has to do with the subject-object distinction. If I hold this up and I say, what is it? And you say, it's a very old cell phone, you really ought to get a new contract, okay? I'll die with this cell phone in my hands. I'm not getting a new cell phone. But the fact of the matter is, there's you and there's this thing, okay? You're the subject, this is the object of your perception, and there's a very clear distinction between them. That's not always the case in social cognition, not least because a major aspect of social cognition is ourselves. We're trying to perceive and make sense of our own behavior and our own feelings and our own desires. The subject-object distinction can break down quite quickly in the social domain in a way in which it doesn't really break down in the non-social domain. You hold up a non-social object and you know it's not you, right? But when you're examining yourself, your own feelings, your own motives, your own beliefs, your own desires, the subject of cognition and the object of cognition are the same thing, which is pretty interesting, okay? The biggest qualitative difference between social cognition, however, and non-social cognition is that in social cognition, the object of cognition is, like the subject of cognition, a sentient being, a person who is aware, who has beliefs and feelings and desires, just like the perceiver has beliefs and feelings and desires. In social cognition, the object of cognition being other people, they're intelligent the way we are, and they're conscious the way we are. They have awareness and they have desires the same way we do. Moreover, when I hold this up and ask you what it is, it doesn't know what I'm doing, right? It's just a thing, you know? But the object of social cognition is aware that he or she is the object of social cognition. Somebody's looking at me, trying to figure out what I'm doing, what I want, what I'm like, what my traits are, and so on, okay? So I'm aware that I'm the object of somebody else's cognitive processes. But to make it even more interesting, by virtue of being aware that I'm the object of somebody else's cognitive processes, I'm in the business of trying to control those cognitions. That's what the social psychologists call impression management, or the sociologist Irving Goffman called strategic self-presentation. We are always in the process of trying to get other people to perceive us in a particular way. They're trying to perceive us. We're trying to control their perceptions of us. We know they're trying to perceive us, and to make things even more interesting, they know we're trying to control their perceptions, okay? So what happens, where'd this go? What happens is you've got the possibility for what the philosophers would call kind of an indefinite series in social cognition. So you've got a person, a perceiver, who's trying to perceive an object, who's also a person. The object of perception knows that the perceiver is trying to perceive the object. The perceiver knows that the object of perception is trying to perceive the object. You can see where this is going, right? It's turtles all the way down in the famous way. Where does it stop? The fact of the matter is there is a kind of reflectivity to social cognition that doesn't occur in other domains. This is whatever it is. It's not trying to make you think it's the Starship Enterprise, you know, or an aircraft carrier or something like that. It's just this thing, right? But we are always in the business of strategically trying to control other people's perceptions of us. And to the extent that other people care about us at all, they are constantly in the business of trying to read between the lines. And because we know that, we're constantly in the business of trying to give them the right lines to read through, okay? And if you don't believe this, just try it out with us. Walk up to somebody and ask them for a date Friday night, okay? Oh, gee, I don't know. Gee, I might be busy. I might have to do my hair that night, or whatever it is that they say, right? And then you guys say, well, would you really like to go out with me? And she just really can't. She really does have to wash her hair that night, or, you know, whatever it is, you know? And then she goes, oh, geez, you know, this isn't working. And then, no, if you're the last man on earth, I wouldn't go out with you. You know, oh, she doesn't really mean that. That's what social interaction is like. And that's what we mean when we say that social interactions are cognitively mediated. We're trying to make sense of a vague, ambiguous, fragmentary stimulus world. How we do that, we'll start talking about next week. Thank you very much.